Alright, since in our previous video we said there is that gap between the two neurons, how then is the electrical impulse going to pass through that gap? So that gap between the two neurons, or that junction, we said is called a synapse. So when these nerve messages arrives at the synaptic gap, what is going to happen is that at the end plates there are vesicles containing neurotransmitters. The vesicles fuse with the cell membrane and the chemical is released into the synaptic gap. Once that chemical is released, the chemical is going to diffuse across the gap and the impulse restarts at the other side. So that's quite something interesting, right? Then we now move on to reflex actions. So when we talk about reflex actions, these are simply automated or stereotyped responses to a stimulus. And then examples of these reflex action could be those quick reflex actions. We have withdrawing the hand from a hot object. Another example could be you jumping up after sitting on a pin, blinking the eye when an object approaches it, shedding of tears when an object enters the eye. All those are examples of quick reflex actions. And then these reflex actions, we say they can either be slow or quick. And under the examples of the quick reflex actions, you can simply use any of the examples that are given here, withdrawing the hand from the hot object or the knee jerk reflex. Under the knee jerk reflex, we are able to see a doctor attending to a patient with a little tiny hammer. So he's hitting the patella of the knee, and we are going to discover to say once this knee is hit, this person is going to kick like that. So that is an example of a quick reflex action. Now, an example of a slow reflex action is the one that is the iris reflex, or the action in the pupil, right, in your eye. So that is an example of the slow reflex action. And then other examples of reflex action include sneezing, salivating, peristalsis, which is the entry of the food bolus into the stomach as it is passing through the alimentary canal. And then we have the vasoconstriction and vasodilation of your blood vessels. And then we have two types of reflex actions, namely we have the spinal and the cranial reflexes. So these are the types of reflex actions. Now, during a spinal reflex action, all right, or the spinal reflex arc, impulses are going to pass through the spinal cord, whereas during a cranial reflex action, impulses are going to pass through the brain. Remember, we said the cranial nerves are those that makes up the brain, and then we have the spinal nerves that are connected to the spinal cord, right? And then we have the reflex arc. So this reflex arc is simply known as the path that is traveled by an electrical impulse during a reflex action. All right, the path traveled by a nerve impulse during a reflex action is known as a reflex arc. For example, we said when a person is touching a hot object, right? We have an example of your skin. So your skin becomes the receptor. So this is the one that is receiving the electrical impulse. So once that nerve message is converted to an electrical impulse, we'll have this sensory neuron carrying that nerve message from the sensory receptor or your sense organ, which is the skin, to the central nervous system. And as the electrical impulse is coming, it is going to meet a tiny gap between the neuron. So this is the interneuron or the relay neuron, and this is the sensory neuron. So there is supposed to be a gap. And how is it going to pass through that gap? Through structures that we call neurotransmitters. And what did we say is that gap called? It is called a synapse, right? So I want you to imagine your electrical impulse is here and it has to pass through here, but the gap is so tiny that it cannot be this bigger. So that tiny gap, how is it going to pass? Using neurotransmitters. Once it reaches in your central nervous system, we'll have the brain that will interpret the message. Once the message has been interpreted by the brain, it has to be taken to the relay neuron, and then this relay neuron is then going to take the message to the motor neuron. And we said the function of the motor neuron is to carry nerve messages from the central nervous system to the effectors. And examples of the effectors we gave were the muscles. So the message is going to come to the motor neuron, which is then going to take to the muscles, which are either going to contract and relax in order to bring about a certain response. Now let's move on. All right, so this is a knee-jerk reflection where someone is going to be hit with a hammer, and as they are hit with the hammer, we know to say the electrical impulse has to come, it has to be taken to the brain, and then once the brain interprets, it has to come back, and then it has to be given back, and then we'll have all right, so the message is moving from here, coming, and then once it's interpreted by the brain, it has to pass through this interneuron, and then it will be taken to the motor neuron. And the motor neuron, remember we said, has got the muscles, which are either going to contract and relax to bring about a certain response. Now let's move on. We have that was us describing the spinal reflex action, right? So we are having this message moving, comes, and then it is taken to the brain for interpretation. Once the brain interprets, it has to bring it back to the interneuron or the relay neuron, which is then going to take the message to the motor neuron. The motor neuron is bringing the message from the central nervous system and taking the message to the effectors, where we have the muscles. That could be either the biceps or the triceps, right? And then we have a conditioned reflex action. Under a conditioned reflex action, we have a scientist by the name of Pavlov. So Pavlov came up with an experiment that we call the Pavlov's experiment. So each time Pavlov would come with food to his dog, he would oftentimes ring the bell, and then the dog would give out certain responses where it would start salivating and wagging the tail, right? And as it will be salivating and wagging the tail, there is a certain response that dog is giving out. So one day, Pavlov decided to come without any food, but he rang the bell, and the dog was still salivating and wagging its tail. And as it was giving that response, Pavlov came up with a conclusion to his experiment. He said a given response has no natural relationship to the stimulus. So that marks the end of our discussion on the neurons. All right, that also marks the end of our discussion on the central nervous system. So just a quick summary as we conclude with our topic. We said the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and whenever we deal with the nerves, we are dealing with the peripheral nervous system. And then this nervous system is also made up of neurons, and we have three basic neurons. We have the sensory neuron, the motor neuron, and the relay neuron. And we said the sensory neuron carries electrical impulses from the sensory receptor, which is your skin or your sense organ, to the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Then we have the motor neuron, which is going to carry the electrical impulses from the central nervous system, which is made up of your brain and the spinal cord, to the effectors. Your effectors could be the skeletal muscles, it could be your muscles of the biceps and the triceps, which are known as antagonistic muscles, acting opposite to each other. And then we have the interneuron, which is also known as the relay neuron, which acts as a connector between the two neurons. And then further on, we discussed and said this sensory neuron has got its cell body outside of the central nervous system. We also talked about the motor neuron, which has the cell body inside the central nervous system. And then we have the relay neuron, which is the connector between the two neurons. And we said there is a gap between two neurons, which we call the synapse, and electrical impulse are going to cross through that synapse using special structures that we call neurotransmitters. And we said examples of these neurotransmitters is acetyl choline, right? And then we have examples of reflex actions, which can be quick or slow reflex actions. And then we discussed on the spinal reflex action, which the electrical impulse is going to pass through this